The year is 1992. The Pittsburgh Penguins have just won the Stanley Cup for the second time in a row. George Bush's vomit still stains the dining jacket of Japanese Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa, and David Letterman isn't very funny. The stage is set for the United Nations World Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. Two conventions focusing on some of the gravest environmental issues facing our planet have been prepared and are expected to be the primary focus of the 105 heads of state in attendance at the plenary hall in Rio Centro. Just before lunchtime on the first day of the Rio conference, Brian Mulroney, Canadian Prime Minister, took to the stage to address the audience at the plenary. Mulroney's speech, which focused primarily on biodiversity, included the optimistic rallying cry that the nations gathered here today have the human genius to create a world free from deprivation and secure from degradation. What remains is for the governments to provide the leadership the world so desperately needs. 18 years down the line, it's only fitting that we see how we're doing. Since Al Gore has already done such a great job on climate change, I'm going to be sticking to the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD. In response to the increasing rate of extinction, ecosystem destruction, and climate change, the United Nations Environmental Program created an ad hoc working group of experts to examine the issue of biodiversity loss and, if needed, develop an international convention to improve it. This group met 5 times before presenting its proposed Convention on Biological Diversity on May 22, 1992, at the UNEP's Nairobi Conference for the adoption of the agreed text of the Convention on Biological Diversity. I hope the organizers did a better job when they were naming their children. This agreed text became open for signing at the Rio Summit on June 15, 1992. With Brian Mulroney's signature on December 4th, Canada became the first industrialized country in the world to ratify the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. What does all this mean for Canada? Well, the CBD is a 30-page document with 42 articles and over 9,000 words, so there's a lot to unpack. But given its length, there's less than you might expect. The Convention on Biological Diversity has 3 primary objectives, and I quote: the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of its components, and the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources, including by appropriate access to genetic resources and by appropriate transfer of relevant technologies, taking into account all rights over those resources and to technologies, and by appropriate funding. In English, this means that the convention is supposed to conserve global biodiversity through sustainable harvesting and use practices and ensure that nations benefit both financially and technologically from their own biological resources. As well, by conserving the planet's genetic diversity, it is also possible that we will be able to use sections of natural genomes in future genetic research. Due to Canada's first world status, remarkably complex legal system, and relatively low levels of biodiversity when compared to tropical nations like Brazil and Bolivia, we are at a much lower risk of the exploitative intellectual property mining and bioprospecting more common in the rainforest and unspoiled wilderness of the global south. The CBD also attempts to ensure that the knowledge and rights of Indigenous peoples not be exploited, but due to Canada's long history of peaceful coexistence and frequent governmental dialogue with its native peoples, we haven't bothered to legislate anything about that yet. Keeping all this in mind, I will focus primarily on Canada's role in the practical conservation and encouragement of biological diversity. While the other articles of the Convention describe at great length the general areas in which action must be taken, they do so without stating measurable goals. This makes sense for a number of pragmatic reasons, but it is not without drawbacks. If the actions outlined were too prescriptive or too stringent, they would reduce the likelihood of nations signing, potentially alienating nations by interfering with their sovereignty and prospects for development. As well, because of the sheer scale of the world and amount we have yet to learn about the interplays of ecosystems, species, and the environment, there simply is not sufficient information available to write a comprehensive step-by-step guide to global action. If we haven't even identified half of the world's species, how can we give reasonable outlines for their protection? Bearing this in mind, many of the responsibilities outlined in the Convention lacked specific targets and timelines beyond meetings not later than 1 year after the entry into force of this convention. So, if we didn't agree to set markers, what did we get ourselves into? I'm glad you asked. Article 6 of the CBD stipulates that each contracting party shall, in accordance with its particular conditions and capabilities, A. Develop national strategies, plans, or programs for the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, or adapt for this purpose existing strategies, plans, or programs which shall reflect, inter alia, the measures set out in this convention relevant to the contracting party concerned, and B. Integrate as far as possible and as appropriate the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity into relevant sectoral or cross-sectoral plans, programs, and policies. Doesn't that just make you want to be a lawyer? Fast forward to 1995. Something else is happening in popular culture, and David Letterman still isn't very funny. In partial fulfillment of Article 6 of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Canadian Biodiversity Strategy is released. This lengthy, yet creatively named strategy set out Canada's plan to A. Conserve biodiversity and promote sustainable use of resources, B. Improve our understanding and management of ecosystems, C. Develop incentives and legislation to support the conservation of biodiversity, and D. Educate about the need to conserve biodiversity. Simply to develop this strategy, the federal government received a mandate from 3 different federal ministries: Parks Canada, Environment Canada, and the Ministry of Natural Resources. The working group established in response consisted of federal, provincial, and territorial employees, as well as academics, non-governmental organizations, and representatives from Indigenous and industrial groups. This large collaborative effort, because of its size and diversity of input, was able to put together a national strategy that could function as a guide for federal action, a symbol of Canada's commitment to environmental protection, and a template for legislation to be developed by lower levels of government. With all this governmental, pseudo-governmental, Indigenous, and non-governmental cooperation, where's the problem? Simply put, Canada is really big. Really, really, really big. Despite drawing so heavily on such a large knowledge base, there's still so much more that we need to know. Current estimates peg us at having identified only 70,000 of the 140,000 estimated Canadian species, and a lack of taxonomists and systematists mean that the problem isn't likely to change anytime soon. As well, because we have and need to involve so many stakeholders in our discussion on biological diversity, it takes a whole lot of time to collate, edit, and synthesize the results into a comprehensive national pool. Furthermore, similar to the problems faced at international conferences, when so many diverse groups are asked for input, their many ulterior motives, biases, and ultimate aims can often be in conflict with one another. So, aside from holding hands and speaking with one another, what has the Canadian Biodiversity Strategy accomplished? We have learned a lot. Not everything we need to know yet, but a lot. In fact, for the past 18 years, we've pretty much been learning all of the time. 2010 is the United Nations International Year of Biodiversity, and to celebrate, and fulfill some of our conventional requirements, Canada has begun to release its long-awaited report on ecosystem status and trends 2010. And despite all of the convention's goals of encouraging public involvement and interaction, it hasn't actually made its full report available to the public yet. The publicly released executive summary includes 22 biodiversity status indicators, but these serve more as a baseline measurement. While this baseline is a crucial part of any undertaking of this scale, and sufficient time is required to ensure that our actions do not lead to terrible unanticipated consequences, for the final product of 18 years' worth of intersectoral collaborative effort, it does seem to be a bit anticlimactic. And perhaps it is these questions of scale, complexity, and time frame that make declining biodiversity such a difficult issue to tackle. Unlike climate change, biodiversity loss has a cute, cuddly, furry, or feathered face that can be seen and can tug at the heartstrings, but it also has the same amorphous, ubiquitous, and not fully understood qualities that make it a formidable foe, as crafty as any fox or wood ape. Canada is trying to protect biodiversity, but because the CBD, as Maurice Strong, organizer of the Rio Conference, put it, lacked teeth, its results have not been as impressive as originally hoped. If a polar bear lacked teeth, could we really expect it to survive and thrive? Perhaps Canada can do its part to protect its share of global biodiversity, but only time will tell. Thank you, and God bless.